At the outset here, I would encourage everyone to generate a particular type of attitude, an intention for this teaching, and that can be very personal for you with whatever brought you here, but in the tradition of which this teaching is a very key, essential part of, which is the tradition of Mahayana Buddhism, that particular attitude that is the heart of these teachings is an attitude called the mind of enlightenment, or bodhicitta, which is an attitude of wishing to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. So may we maybe bring that as our intention, thinking, having heard these teachings, may I put them into practice in order to be able to bring all beings beyond suffering and to the ultimate state of enlightenment. And with that, we will come around to our main topic, which is the Heart Sutra, as Rachel introduced for us tonight. And I'm going to say just a few things for those of you who weren't here last week to kind of set the stage for tonight's talk. So last week, luckily for those of you who weren't here, I didn't actually talk about the Heart Sutra. I mean, not explicitly. We didn't go through the words of the sutra. I was talking about the context of the sutra, where it kind of lies in the scope of the Buddha's teachings. What are the main topics, or what is the main topic, and why does that matter? Why would you care about that? Why would you want to meditate on that or incorporate that into your view? And so I'll say a few words just about that. And so starting off, as for the context, traditionally it's said that the Buddha taught three main kind of cycles of teachings. And the first, we call that the first time he turned the wheel of Dharma, using some Buddhist jargon there. And they say the first set of the Buddha's teachings were the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. And essentially the main topic of that was the absence of, or the idea of individual selflessness, meaning that the idea of an individual independently existing I or me, like in the case of myself, like that Justin, is actually just a concept. And that by fixating on that as if it were real and solid, that is the actual root of all of the displeasure, all of the suffering, all of the challenges that I will face in my life. And that is the root of what we call samsaric existence, or this ongoing cycle of dissatisfaction. And so by meditating on, by breaking down and then meditating on the absence of this seemingly independent, seemingly permanent, seemingly singular self, then we can overcome our own personal suffering and stop creating the causes which keep us locked in the cycle of suffering. However, that is still not the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. We could say that freedom from one's own suffering is a stage of development, and the attainment of complete enlightenment and the state of omniscience, which is the state of Buddhahood, is the ultimate attainment, or the ultimate goal, you might say. And that to attain that, you need essentially two things. So for one, in terms of that view of reality in connection to that first level of teachings, the Buddha takes that analysis of reality beyond only analyzing and finding the absence of the individual self, but also takes that same reasoning to demonstrate, and hopefully in the minds of the students, for them to be able to realize and fully experience the lack of an intrinsic reality of not only the individual self, but of all phenomena, of everything that you could ever experience. Even the components that we think of that make up this seemingly existing self. And so that is what the explicit main topic of this Heart Sutra is. So taking that examination that would have been done just to find the lack of self, and then applying it to all the other components of experience. And then the third level of teachings, we often, in terms of naming these three sets of teachings, we call them the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the teaching of the absence of characteristics, or the turning of the wheel of characteristiclessness, and that's a mouthful. And then the third is called often it's called the thoroughly distinguished set of teachings. But anyway, the main point of the third cycle of teachings is to talk about Buddha nature. So we will use the same kind of term in different contexts of sometimes you'll see the word emptiness. Like for example, in this text, you'll see the word emptiness a lot. In addition, you'll see the word the perfection of wisdom, which is another way of talking about emptiness. And then in that third set of teachings, you'll see the word Buddha nature, which is just another way of talking about emptiness, but from a different perspective. So if you want to know more about the whole set and setting of those three sets of teachings, I would really suggest, if you really want to go into it, there are another set of teachings on our YouTube channel of Ken Rinpoche teaching, a cycle of teachings called The Nature of Mind, which talks about all the different ways that Buddha talked about mind from the most fundamental in the Four Noble Truths teachings all the way up to the more subtle levels of teachings on the nature of mind. And that will go into these three sets of teachings. Anyway, the point of my even bringing this up is to kind of set the setting that this is of the second set of teachings, and that what the Buddha is going to be talking about is the absence of any kind of intrinsic existence, independent existence of all phenomena, all components of our experience. So let's go into, and I said there are two aspects, or two things that would be the causes of Buddhahood. One is the realization of all of these, the absence of intrinsic existence of all phenomena. The second is the attitude of bodhicitta, or the intention of bodhicitta. And from one perspective, those are one and the same when we talk about bodhicitta as conventional and ultimate bodhicitta, but let's not get into that. That's not really the topic of tonight's talk. So let's get into the actual sutra, because we don't have a ton of time, and I do want to address the actual words of this teaching. So, the text begins, Homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. And the title itself is called The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Now, the reason it is called the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom is that you could also say that this is the heart of the Buddha, or the heart of the Buddhist path, or the heart of enlightenment, the essence of enlightenment, the essence of the perfection of wisdom. And what that essence is this view of emptiness, or the view of the lack of intrinsic reality of any phenomena. And the reason that's called the heart, or the essence of those teachings, or of this view, is because I addressed this a little bit in the first talk, but every other thing that we might think of that's Buddhist-y, or part of a Buddhist path, things like patience, nonviolence, generosity, ethics, kindness, compassion, none of those things will get you enlightened on their own. They're all nice, and they all will generate causes and conditions that can lead you to be able to generate the particular view of reality that will get you enlightened, but they on their own will not. So in The Way of the Bodhisattva, Shantideva says, all of these other branches were taught by the Muni, by the Buddha, for the purpose of wisdom, meaning that all of those other aspects are all there as a method for getting you closer to and giving you the causes and conditions within yourself, setting up the correct situation that you can generate this wisdom, this heart of perfection, of the perfection of wisdom, this view of emptiness, which is the direct cause of liberation, the direct cause of awakening. So, and I talked more in the last talk about how that is and why realizing emptiness would set you free and all of that. And for now, I'm not going to go back into that again. That was another big part of what the first talk was, is what is emptiness? Why should you care? What benefit would there be in meditating on something called emptiness? It sounds kind of dark and nihilistic, right? So I would suggest you go back and check that out. So let's go into the text itself. Now, another bit here that you might be curious about, and I talked about this a little bit the first time too, is it calls it the Blessed Mother. So why is it called the Mother? The Mother is kind of a nickname, you could say, for all of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, all of the texts of the Perfection of Wisdom. So I mentioned last time that there is a version of the Perfection of Wisdom which is 100,000 lines long. It's many volumes. Then there's like a 20,000 line, a 10,000 line, an 8,000 line, 300 line called the Diamond Sutra, this text which is called the Heart Sutra, and then even the most condensed, the Perfection of Wisdom in a single syllable. So just the syllable ah expresses like all of the perfection of wisdom to the right person, you might say. So it is called the mother because it is this view of reality, this experience, you might say, this state of mind that generates, that is the primary cause of, is the mother of all Buddhas. So, homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Thus did I hear at one time. So thus did I hear, generally in almost any commentary you read, this is referring to Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's primary disciples and known as one of his most intelligent disciples. This is a side point, but many people, when they read about some of the history of the sutras, they may think, I don't know, it seems like great philosophy, but I don't really know if I believe this is the Buddha's words, because, if you really study how the Buddha's sutras came to be, it is that these students memorized what the Buddha said and then wrote it down later. I don't know that I can offer any more clarity, but I can offer you a little bit of personal experience coming from and living in a tradition of people who hold memorization as a key part of the way that they study religion and philosophy. And being in India with some of these masters of the Tibetan tradition. So I'll just tell you a little aside here. Two things. One, I was staying in a monastery in South India for some time, and I had a private teacher. And just I was talking to him about memorization, because it's a big part of the monastic study is to memorize books. And I was kind of teasing him, oh, you didn't really memorize these books. There's a whole bookshelf, and he had memorized all of these books. And he's like, test me. And I pulled a random book off the shelf, and I started reading a line, and he could pick up from where I was reading on any page. I'm not joking. And then there was a guy at Dzongsar Monastery. So Dzongsar Shedra of Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche's monastery. It was very close to the monastery that I lived in and studied in. And there was a guy at that monastery who just in the span of a few weeks or a month memorized a 300-page book. And to that level where you could just open a random page, start reading a line, and he could pick up from where you left off. So I only say this to kind of, we live in such a distracted society of, we can't even imagine memorizing something like that. This is not only not uncommon, but it's almost the norm in this Indian and Tibetan culture. And even to this day, in the Brahmin culture of India, the Brahmin caste, people who are brought up as priests, they are made to orally memorize all the Vedas. So it is very much a real thing. It's very much possible that these were accurately recorded. I have no doubts for myself. You can entertain doubts if you choose to, but I just thought I would share that a little bit. So, thus have I heard at one time, the Blessed One was residing on Vulture Peak Mountain at Rajgira, together with a great Sangha of monks and a great Sangha of bodhisattvas. So just to get into the words here a little bit, the Tibetans always gloss the word Blessed One as Chomdendi, which means the one who has overcome the maras or overcome the afflictions, something like that. So that's kind of their way of talking about what it means to be the Blessed One. Vulture Peak is a place in the state of Bihar in India. You can go there. I've been there. And it is a mountain that looks like a vulture, kind of. It's like the peak of the mountain. Anyway, this is most of the Buddha's teachings about this topic of emptiness, and in this, what we call the second turning of the wheel of characteristiclessness, happened at this place called Vulture Peak Mountain. And the reason it says a Sangha of monks and a Sangha of bodhisattvas, you might think, well, why can't the monks be bodhisattvas? And just in terms of the way that they're speaking in this, when they say monks, they're often speaking from the perspective that the monastic tradition and even the vows that you take as a monk are a part of the Theravada tradition, or part of what we call the vehicle of individual liberation, which means that when you take those vows, you take them with the intention that I will take them until I die, and I take them kind of for the purpose of this renunciation, that I will take them for my own freedom, something like that. In the Tibetan tradition, because monasticism and bodhisattva practice and all these things are very much merged together, it all kind of mixes together, and you get the bodhisattva intention together with the monastic vows and all that kind of stuff. But historically, when they talk about bodhisattvas, they're often in the sutras talked about as lay people who are not monastics. So there's like kind of a separation in the way that they're talked about if you read some of these sutras and you're kind of confused. So even if you look at visual depictions of like Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Vajrapani, the 8 close sons, something like that, Tara, all of the close bodhisattvas, they're all wearing jewelry and silken robes. So they're dressed as lay people. They're not in monastic robes. So anyway, just a little clarification there. At that time, the Blessed One rested in an absorption on the categories of phenomena called illumination of the profound. So basically what this is saying is that the Buddha was sitting there fully absorbed in the nature of reality. And one thing to know is it's not like the Buddha was meditating and spacing out or something. Buddhas don't meditate and then stop meditating at another time. There's no difference between what we would call meditation and post-meditation for a Buddha. But at the same time, there are times when the Buddha might, we could say, display the way of meditating to inspire others. And so, at the same time, the Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, was practicing the profound perfection of wisdom, looked and saw that the 5 aggregates are also empty of intrinsic nature. So, it's kind of like the Buddha is meditating on reality. And then Avalokiteshvara, who is one of the closest disciples of the Buddha, known as the supreme compassionate one of all the Buddha's disciples. And then it says, due to the Buddha's power, the Venerable Shariputra asked the Bodhisattva, the great being, noble Avalokiteshvara. So through the power means that he was inspired. The Buddha's kind of meditating, Avalokiteshvara is meditating. They're like absorbed in the nature of reality. And Shariputra, this is interesting because it's, due to his power that he would ask this question, because otherwise, this is the way it's talked about in some of the commentaries, Shariputra being one of the individual liberation kind of character, meaning he's not maybe even really interested for himself in the nature of emptiness of all phenomena. He's really pursuing the emptiness of the individual self, but he's inspired in this moment by the Buddha and Avalokiteshvara to ask these questions. This is the way it's talked about in some of the traditional commentaries. So, he asks a question to Avalokiteshvara. And this is what I talked about last time, that I said that there are ways of talking about the Buddha's teachings that this is called a sutra. And generally when we say a sutra, we're talking about the words of the Buddha. This text isn't really the words of the Buddha. It's called the words taught by the blessing of the Buddha, which is still considered a category of the Buddha's teachings. So anyway, this conversation happened, you could say, through the inspiration or through the blessing of the Buddha. So, through the Buddha's power, the Venerable Shariputra asked the Bodhisattva, the great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, how should sons of a noble family or daughters of a noble family train if they wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? The Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, replied to the Venerable Saradvatiputra, this is a long way of saying Shariputra. Shariputra, sons of noble family or daughters of noble family who wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should see things in this way. They should correctly observe the 5 aggregates to be empty of an intrinsic nature. So I introduced this topic just a little bit last time about what are these 5 aggregates and how the 5 aggregates form kind of the basis for our concept of self. Okay, so I'll rehash this a little bit. So at first he just says you should see them in this way, and then later he goes through them one by one. So that's coming here in a moment. So when we think of I, or a self, what we're thinking of is 5 things. And the reason these 5 things are called aggregates is because they themselves are also not some independently existing thing. They are also groupings, you might say, or often they are called the transitory collection, meaning that they're always changing. They're collections of things, but we see them as if they kind of independently exist, something like that. So those 5 things are form. And form in this context, initially you can think of as just your body, but it actually encompasses all forms. So when I think Justin, a large part of what I'm thinking about or what I'm relating to is my body, being an embodied being. The second of those is feeling or sensation, you might say. I think maybe sensation's a better word because it's not about like I feel like this or that. It's like the initial contact. When my mind contacts an object, there's a feeling of pleasure, displeasure, or neutrality towards that. And that kind of maybe will instigate or be a predecessor to the way I react to that situation or feeling or thought or whatever is happening. So then the second or the third of those is called perception. You might think of it as labeling, though. So it's like I have a feeling, I contacted something, and then I label it as good or bad or up or down or Jessica or Mark or whatever. Like I'm, or within myself, like I'm good, I'm bad, I'm Justin, all of those kind of things. And it's not just a self-referential, it's labeling anything. But that's another aspect of how we identify ourselves is through these kind of labels and labeling. The next one, the fourth, is called, sometimes it's translated as formation. Sometimes it's translated as conditioning factors. At any rate, from one perspective, it is the emotional content of our experience. From another context, it's kind of like, you read 5 different commentaries about the 5 aggregates, and you're going to get some different answers, especially about this aggregate. So from one perspective, it is the emotional content of a particular mental state. Like when I see something, it's not just a bare vision. I see it. There's also a feeling around it. Like when I see someone who I desire, then along with the seeing, there's desire. There might be like attraction. There might be an intention to like move towards them, something like that. All of that's kind of there in the experience of seeing them. So this is formation or conditioning factors. The last one is consciousness. And consciousness, that is a complex topic itself, but it mainly would be talking about your sense consciousnesses and your thinking mind. And there's a lot more complicated. I could give a whole probably 2-hour talk just about the 8 consciousnesses and how that functions, blah, blah, blah. Maybe a good topic for another time. But right now, just think of it as your perceptions of the world, like your senses, as well as your thinking mind. So it's on the basis of all of these things that we label a self. We think, okay, my body, my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions, my identities, like those kind of labels that I bring in, all of those things. And it's not like we think about this. This is on the subconscious level of identity and like fixation, grasping, that we then label an I, a Justin, whatever. When I actually investigate that, then what I look into is I look for where is this so-called I in this collection of things. And what I find is my body, my feelings, my identities, my emotions or my impulses, and my thoughts, my experiences, those kind of things. But where is this me that supposedly possesses or controls or experiences all of this stuff? And so I'm not going to go too far into this, but if you were to explore this on your own, if you were to really go into this in an analytic process and meditate on this, what the Buddha says you will find is that you won't find, basically, an independently truly existing self. All there is like an idea of a self based on all these factors. So where this sutra picks up now is, okay, cool, the self's not real, but what about this body? What about this form? What about these feelings? What about these perceptions? So that's where we go from a discussion of merely breaking down the individual self to breaking down actually every component of experience, even the things that we think of as the reference when we think of a self or like an I or something like that. So this is going a step deeper into the analysis or into the kind of breaking down any kind of fixed concept about reality whatsoever. So that's why he comes here and says that they should observe the 5 aggregates to be empty of an intrinsic nature. So we're not just going to the self, we're also going into those components that were the basis for us even imagining a self. So this is when the main part of the sutra comes in, and this is the next 4 lines, or the next couple lines are the most famous lines that most people will quote when they talk about the Heart Sutra, okay? So, form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form, and form is not other than emptiness. So this is what's called the 4 applications of emptiness, and there are whole commentaries just based on these 4, on this statement right here. And if you watched what we sent in the follow-up email last time, the video with Namchat Khen Rinpoche teaching about emptiness, it's about the Heart Sutra, but he didn't really address the Heart Sutra too much explicitly. He mainly talks about this statement. And so when we say form is empty, we can start with a simple object or a particular form. So let's just start with the body. And when I said before that it's easiest for now just to think of the body, there's something called, this is a little bit complicated, but there's something called the ayatana of form, and then there's the element of form, or the, there's 2 different ways of talking about form. One is form as just as something you can see with your eyes, and that's one way of talking about form. There's another way of, when we say form, that includes visual forms, things that we can hear, things that we can taste, things that we can smell, and any kind of things that we can feel with our tactile senses. So anyway, when we say form in this, it actually refers to all forms, but in the initial investigation, I think it's easier just to think of as your body. So the reason I say that it encompasses everything is actually when this investigation happens, going through the 5 aggregates actually is supposed to cover everything that exists. According to Buddhism, like the only things that exist are matter and consciousness. There are other categories of things. This is technical Buddhist philosophy stuff. There's something called non-associated compositional factors, but let's not worry too much about that. Essentially what it means is there are things that are imputed to exist based on things that do exist. Like for example, time is a non-associated compositional factor. So according to Buddhism, time doesn't exist, but things that exist, at least conventionally, by observing the way they change, we can say that X amount of time has passed. But time's not really a thing. Time doesn't exist on its own. It's like on the basis of the movement of the sun through the sky, then we can say X amount of time passed. But what is this so-called time? Anyway, that's something called non-associated compositional factors. Let's not worry about that. The point is that when you examine and you go through and see that there's no such thing as an inherently existing form, feeling, perception, formation, or consciousness, then essentially you've seen the emptiness of all phenomena, basically. So, when we say form is empty, what we mean is that even if I were to look for a body that I thought is a truly existing thing, like I might think that, and when we say truly existing, what we mean is you can often, in the most easy way, think of this as having 3 characteristics as the way that our kind of de facto mind works. It's as if things are permanent, independently existing, and singular. So if we look for this kind of body that exists in and of itself, it isn't dependent on other factors, we won't find it existing in any of these ways. So for example, the body's not permanent. I think that's quite obvious if we look at just like the thing that I think of as my body from even a few days ago to now. The hair on my beard has grown, like my energy levels are different throughout the day. If we want to go further back, it's really easy to see like 10, 15 years ago, I still had hair on the top of my head, all these kind of things. So it's quite obvious the body's not permanent. The body also does not independently exist. Like, for example, if I eat more food, it's going to get bigger. If I eat less food, it's going to get smaller. If I don't sleep, I'm going to feel fatigued. All of those things. So the body does not independently exist. It's also not singular because it's made up of all these different parts. And when we try to find this so-called singular body, it's kind of in the same way that we investigated the self. When we look for a body, what I find is like the arms of the body, the fingers of the body, the hair of the body, the bones of the body. But where is this so-called body as a singular thing that possesses or contains all of these parts? And if I were to, Khen Rinpoche in his teaching on emptiness, he takes an example of like a napkin. And he says, okay, this napkin, you think of this as a square. And then when I tear this piece of it off and I hold it over here, where'd the square go? Your concept of a square was dependent upon parts, dependent upon shapes, dependent on things. Similarly, the concept of a body is a dependent phenomena. It does not independently exist. So, we're going to talk just for a minute about how this goes with form is emptiness, or form is empty, emptiness is form, and these 4 statements. So, okay, when we examine a form or a body, and we find that it does not independently exist, that is finding or seeing the emptiness of that form. Now, when we say emptiness is form, the idea of that is, so in Ken Rinpoche's teaching, this is from another commentary of a teacher named Vajrapani. He says that you can think about this from the perspective of a being who has realized emptiness and a being who has not realized emptiness. So the being who has realized emptiness will say that they're seeing this thing that the realized being sees as emptiness, and they think it's form. So the realized being sees this and sees emptiness, and I, as an unrealized being who's still attached, sees a body, sees my body. So I'm seeing emptiness as form. So that's the way that they talk about this. So the idea is that, and this comes up in the next 2 statements, emptiness is not other than form, and form is not other than emptiness, that it's not like emptiness is something over there that's separate from any phenomena that we're talking about. Like if I'm talking about the emptiness of my body, it's not something that's separate from the body. It is the very nature of the body itself. When I examine to try to find some independently, permanently existing body and I don't find it, that itself is the emptiness of the body. So if I threw out the body, there's no such thing as an emptiness of the body. If I threw out the emptiness of the body, there's no such thing as a body. Because the emptiness of the body is the very nature of the body. So it's only in our deluded, unrealized experience that we can even say that bodies exist. Of course, conventionally speaking, this all sounds ridiculous, but we're not talking about convention. We're talking about the way that our minds fixate on things, and by the process of that fixation is why we're stuck in an experience of dissatisfaction and suffering. So, anyway, then the next 2 statements, emptiness is not other than form is not other than emptiness, is there to show that these are not separate things. So in Mipam Rinpoche, famous teacher in the Nyingma tradition, wrote a book called The Beacon of Certainty. And in that, he says that a lot of people's thoughts about what appearance and emptiness, or form and emptiness in this case, is, and the union of that, is it's like a black string and a white string, and they're twisted together, and then they try to say that that's a union. And he says it's not like that at all, because you can never separate the form from its emptiness. It's not even a separate thing. So you should never think of things and their emptiness as 2 separate things. The emptiness is the very nature of things, and that's what you try to see. That's what we're trying to experience through every Buddhist practice, is ultimately leading you to wanting to experience that. So, then, he says then, in the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are empty. So he's saying that then you should explore that same kind of idea of emptiness in all of these other aspects which form the components upon which you imagine the idea of the self. So then he says, Shariputra, therefore all phenomena are emptiness. So therefore is saying, like, if you realize the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, you got it. You've realized the emptiness of all phenomena. They are without characteristics. So what does it mean to be without characteristics? Things only have characteristics, and when it says characteristics, we're talking about ultimately. We're not talking about conventionally. Of course, conventionally you can say, Justin's 44, he's got a beard, he's bald, he's whatever he is. Those are characteristics we can talk about. But ultimately speaking, all of those are still just dependent perceptions based on our delusion. Yeah. So, ultimately speaking, they are without characteristics. They are unborn and unceasing. So, unborn and unceasing, when we talk in terms of conventional truth in Buddhist philosophy, the 3 characteristics of something existing are that they are born, or that they arise, they abide for some amount of time, and then they cease. So what it's saying here is that they're unborn and unceasing. And this is another way of talking in the middle way or emptiness philosophy, or even in some of the higher teachings. They'll say that all phenomena are unborn, and if you understand that they're unborn, if something was never born, it can never die. So another way, they'll say, let's not go into that. That's just another way of speaking. But the point is that when we say they're unborn, it means that there's no truly independently existing permanent kind of state of birth or arising. So all of these things it's not negating that conventionally a seed gives rise to a sprout or a mother gives birth to a child. Obviously, that would be ridiculous, and the Buddha's not stupid. He's talking about that our way of relating to these concepts is one that's very fixed. We're very stuck. That it's as if that is real in the sense of being permanent, being independently existing, and so on and so forth. So there's a famous quote from Nagarjuna that says, whatever is born from conditions is unborn. It doesn't have the nature of birth. What that means is, what they're refuting is birth as like a fixed thing, like an independently existing phenomena. So if it arises from conditions, it doesn't arise. That's the statement, which sounds totally oxymoronic, but we're talking about the two truths here. You have to understand, in the context of the two truths, all of these teachings are talking from the one context, we're saying feeling, even to be able to talk about feeling, we have to be speaking on the level of conventional truth. When I described what the aggregates are, that's only a conventional explanation. Now the Buddha is saying that they don't exist, or that there is no form, and so forth. That is speaking from the ultimate perspective, that ultimately speaking, or from the nature of reality itself, form is only a concept. It's not a real thing. It's a deluded projection of the unenlightened mind. So, all phenomena are emptiness. They are without characteristics, unborn, unceasing, without stains, and without the absence of stains, not deficient and not complete. So this is an interesting way of speaking here, and what they're talking about is often a way of speaking is that there's conventionally speaking, and this interesting to think about this as only convention. It's only conventionally speaking that we can even talk about there being suffering and a freedom of suffering. Those also don't inherently exist. So that's what he's talking about here, that there's no stain and there's no freedom from stain. Like stain would be samsara, freedom from stain would be nirvana. That's also just a concept. So the idea is that in this state of the perfection of wisdom, in the state of emptiness, in the realization of this, there's no stain, there is no suffering, there is no going beyond suffering. There is no attainment or non-attainment. That's coming later. Not deficient and not complete. So different commentaries will explain these words slightly differently, like deficient and complete, stained and not stained, but generally stained and not stained usually is talking about samsara and nirvana. In terms of not deficient and not complete, meaning like that we as a person are not deficient, ultimately speaking, like there's no fault or no problem with us, nor is there any complete or perfected state of qualities, like in terms of enlightenment, ultimately speaking, that these are also just concepts. Conventionally speaking, of course, we can talk about a person such as ourselves who is still trapped in their emotions and their fixations, and that there is a state of enlightenment where all those qualities that if we think of them as something to be gained, we will gain them. If we think of them as something that's already in us, right now we think of them as obscured, and later they will become realized. Ultimately speaking, none of that applies. Those are all just concepts. So, now, not deficient and not complete. There we go. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formations, no consciousness. So once again, that's just repeating the five aggregates. No eye, no ears, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no texture, no mental object. So this is something called the 12 ayatanas, and there's something called the 16 dhatus, or the 18 dhatus. And these are another way of speaking from Buddhist philosophy about all the components of your experience. So that you have then the next line says, no element of the I up to the element of the mind, and all the way up to the element of the mind consciousness. And here the word element is referring to your sense faculties. So when we have an experience of any object, we have a consciousness, a sense faculty, and an object that we would experience. Sorry, the element in this means, the element of the I means physical form. The element of the mind means mental phenomena. And in between those, what they're referring to, up to means including smells, sounds, tastes, tactile sensations, all of those things. So it says no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no texture, no mental object, as well as the consciousnesses of those things. So you have a consciousness, you have a sense faculty, and you have an object. And those are the basis of anything you could experience, in addition to the mental phenomena. So like I see something, then I have a mental concept of it, then I can have an idea of it in my mind. So I can think about an orange, and I can see an orange with my eyes, and those are different levels of perception. So that's what they're talking about when we talk about the element of the mind consciousness. Anyway, the point is that none of those things also inherently exist. Any object of consciousness or the mind or the senses that see that. We only have 10 minutes? Oh my God.
We have a whole other.
We do have a whole other session, but I wanted to get through the words of the text, so we're going to rush a little bit here. There is no ignorance, no exhaustion of ignorance, up to no aging and death, and no exhaustion of aging and death. So this is talking about other categories of Buddhist philosophy, talking about the 12 links of dependent origination. So there is, if we were to have ignorance, then after ignorance, then we go into all the other stages. Ignorance is the source of the 12 links of dependent origination. The exhaustion of ignorance is the reversal of the 12 links of dependent origination. If we stop ignorance, then we will no longer experience suffering, we will no longer fixate, we will no longer be propelled into rebirth, so on and so forth. So what they're saying here by saying up to, they're just including all the 12 links of dependent origination by only saying the first one and the last ones. And then there is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, no non-attainment. Again, here, talking about the Four Noble Truths. Also, the Four Noble Truths don't truly exist. They don't independently exist. They are also just projections of the mind. Very useful projections of the mind, in the sense that, let me give one couple words here of context, that this teaching is just showing you, okay, maybe my sense of self isn't real. But as a Buddhist, maybe I have attachment to these aspects that like the path's real, or Buddha's real, or something like that. Samsara's real, nirvana's real. And saying even that's not real, and if you still keep holding on to that, that's still going to keep you trapped in this worldview. And again, remember that this is speaking from the ultimate perspective. All of these concepts that are being negated right now are important things that we need to actually kind of understand and practice, the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, practice the path. But ultimately, what we're trying to realize is that none of that independently or permanently or singularly exists. So, no attainment, no non-attainment, no wisdom. Yeah, negating everything, basically. Shariputra, therefore, since bodhisattvas have no attainment, they rely upon and dwell in the perfection of wisdom. Because their minds have no veils, they have no fear. Having utterly gone beyond error, they reach the culmination of nirvana. So, their minds have no veils. That is referring to if you are seeing reality directly, then you have overcome the obscuring factors of this ignorance and fixation, which were preventing you from seeing that. And if you are seeing things as they are, and you are experiencing everything in its state of emptiness, you will have no fear of anything. So, all the Buddhas who reside in the three times have likewise fully awakened to unsurpassed and perfect awakening by relying upon the perfection of wisdom. This goes back to what I said before, that all these other things we think of as Buddhism, ethics, compassion, generosity, that's not what got anyone enlightened. They are helpful. They are, you might call, supportive conditions, but they're not the primary cause. The primary cause of enlightenment of all the Buddhas of the three times was the perfection of wisdom, this realization of emptiness. Therefore, The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is the mantra of great knowledge, unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, and the mantra that utterly pacifies all suffering. Since it is not false, it should be known to be true. Man, maybe I should hold off on this section because actually we could talk about just this one piece for 20 minutes probably. However, I'll just give a brief bit and we'll go into this a little bit more detail the next time. The one thing to know about this idea of mantra is that, for one thing, sometimes a mantra can evoke some kind of spiritual state. From another perspective, you'd say that the mantra is the state. Mm-hmm. So it's like we can talk about emptiness, then in the same way that we were just saying emptiness is form and form is emptiness and all that kind of stuff, you could say that with sound. And then there are particular sounds maybe that directly evoke the experience of emptiness, something like that. So that's one way of talking about a mantra, that the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is itself the perfection of wisdom in the form of sound, something like that. So that's one way of talking about it. So I'm just going to give a brief word summary of what these words mean. And also, if you read 5 commentaries to the Heart Sutra, the way they explain gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisattva is slightly different in almost all of them. So, tadyata means kind of like, it's like this. Something like that. Gate gate means gone, gone. Paragate means gone beyond. Parasamgate means gone beyond the beyond. Bodhisattva means something like enlightenment is ensured, something like that. So, one way of talking about this is gate gate means moving from, and this is also, just more Buddhist concepts, but we talk about the 5 paths: the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, the path of no more learning. I'm sorry, I'm just listing things off really fast. But they are kind of levels of practice. Like from the path of accumulation, let's say we're a person who's generated the intention for enlightenment. We've really developed the attitude of bodhicitta. If that's really authentically established within us, that's a way of talking about being on the path of accumulation. The path of joining is when we really start meditating on emptiness, but it's still maybe conceptual, but we're having gaining experiences. The path of seeing is when we have a direct experience of emptiness. Direct in the sense that there's no more just like some idea or logic propelling our mind into it, but we're having a direct experience in the same way that I directly see this, plant in my vision. I would be seeing emptiness without the intermediary of some kind of concept or logic or something like that. The path of meditation is, okay, I've seen it directly, but I still need to get used to it maybe. And then after I'm fully used to it, fully familiarized with it, I would attain enlightenment. That's the path of no more learning. So in quite a few of the commentaries, they ascribe this mantra as saying, gone, gone means going from the path of accumulation to the path of joining. Gone beyond means going from the path of joining to the path of meditation, or path of seeing. Gone beyond the beyond means transcending the path of, seeing and meditation, and going into bodhisattva means enlightenment is established, going into the path of no more learning. So essentially it's just saying, progressing through the stages of the path, through this experience or through this practice of the perfection of wisdom, and then, establishing oneself in enlightenment. That one would be established in enlightenment. And, this is such a short thing, but one thing to know is that the Heart Sutra is a text that not that many people, it's not that they don't, but less people study it and more people chant it. It's like the most commonly chanted and recited text in the Buddhist world, probably. And often what happens is in the Tibetan world is that they study all these other aspects about emptiness. They study the texts of Nagarjuna, of Chandrakirti. They receive direct instructions from their teachers in how to meditate on emptiness through different methods, different levels, both from a sutra level of vipassana meditation through different levels of tantric, Mahamudra, Dzogchen. All these kind of things are different ways and levels of subtlety of meditating on emptiness. But anyway, people will more meditate and learn about emptiness through those kind of ways, and then just chant this text as a way of kind of evoking or invoking like that kind of experience and connecting with the Buddha and kind of reminding themselves of the meaning of emptiness and how to apply that to everything in their experience, that it's not just something to do when you sit on the cushion, that it is to be an experience of reality in all things, that kind of thing. So my point in saying this is that I would also encourage you all just to like chant this out loud, not even like pausing to try to like, oh, what does that mean and what was that word? Just chant it and let the words kind of pass through you and get used to it in that way too. So the end of this then says, Shariputra, this is the way a bodhisattva great being should train in the perfection of wisdom. So this means you should see everything as emptiness, you know? And one thing that Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche really emphasized in this is at the beginning, the question was never, and Avalokiteshvara's answer was never, this is how you meditate on emptiness. He didn't say that. He said, this is how you should practice the perfection of wisdom, by seeing everything in this way. And that doesn't mean just when you're sitting around and contemplating or when you're sitting on the meditation cushion, but like you should learn to see everything in that way all the time. So, then the Blessed One arose from that absorption and gave his approval to the Bodhisattva, the great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, saying, excellent, excellent, son of noble family, it is like that. Son of noble family, it's like that. The profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced just as you have taught, and even the thus gone ones will rejoice. So, I said again at the last talk that there were three kinds of the Buddha's teachings. Teachings spoken from the Buddha's mouth, teachings taught by the blessing of the Buddha, and then teachings that were added with permission by the Buddha. So up to now, we have had get with permission by the Buddha when he said, this teaching, thus I have heard, the Buddha was resting in Rajgir with a great Sangha of Bodhisattvas and a great Sangha of monastics, whatever, that's with permission of the Buddha. The Buddha said, you can add context to the text. Then right here, we just got the only bit of from the Buddha's mouth, because we had the whole rest part was by the blessing of the Buddha, or by the inspiration of the Buddha. Then right here, the Buddha spoke. Excellent, excellent, son of noble family, it's like that. So that's words of the Buddha. Then the last bit right here, when the Blessed One had said this, and to the end, that is more with permission by the Buddha. So just more context. When the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable, I'm just going to say Shariputra, I'm not good at pronouncing Sanskrit, the Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, and the entire assembly, as well as the world with its devas, humans, asuras, and gandharvas, rejoiced and praised what the Blessed One had said. So, this completes the great vehicle sutra, the heart of the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. And so I know that was a bit of a rush, and the next time we come back together, we're going to talk more explicitly just about the union of the two truths, the connection between form and emptiness, emptiness is form, and so on and so forth, the fourfold application of emptiness, and we'll go a bit more about the mantra. But I felt like it would be kind of weird to just stop in the middle of this, because it's such short text, so we kind of rushed through that.